For the latest on the crisis in the Middle East, let us go to CNN's Wolf Blitzer.
Thanks very much, Fareed. It's just past 5 p.m. here in Jerusalem on this, the 27th day of Israel's Operation Protective Edge. Today, the Palestinian Health Ministry said at least 10 people were killed when Israeli shells landed near a UN-run school in southern Gaza that was sheltering almost 3,000 people. No official comment yet from Israel on this attack. Those 10 become part of the sobering statistics of this war. In Gaza, more than 1,750 people have been killed, so says the Palestinian Health Ministry. The UN estimates 70 to 80% of the dead there are civilians. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations disputes that. He says last week that about half of the dead are actually Hamas combatants. And in Israel, officials say 64 soldiers have been killed and 3 civilians. Israel says at last count it has struck 4,626 targets in Gaza via attacks from air, ground, and sea. And then at last count, Gaza has launched 3,180 rockets, mortars, or missiles into Israel. In fact, sirens have been going off the last few minutes in Tel Aviv, in the Tel Aviv area right now. On Friday, a temporary ceasefire led by the U.S. and the UN brought a glimmer of hope, but any sense of optimism was completely destroyed when 3 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza shortly after the ceasefire began. Here on GPS today, you're going to hear from the man who's standing here with me, Mark Regev. He's the chief spokesman for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But first, we're going to hear from a man who rarely speaks out. Don't hear from him much publicly. The leader of Hamas, Khaled Meshaal. He sat down for an exclusive interview with CNN's Nick Robertson, and Nick is joining us now live. Nick, you had a wide-ranging interview with Khaled Meshaal. Did he leave any opening for a potential ceasefire with Israel?
He left a very big opening for at least a humanitarian truce. He said that's definitely on the table. And he says, as far as Hamas is concerned, yes, they are open for a lasting ceasefire. But he has demands. He says that the demands are that the blockade around Gaza must be lifted. I asked him specifically, what did he mean about that? He wants the borders open. He wants the international airport there working. He wants the sea, access to the sea, a port for Gaza. He wants them to be able to live as any other people in the world. Those were his terms for what he wants. I asked him if he was willing to stop the rocket firing, to stop the tunnel building. All of these, he said, are possible. The rocket firing can be stopped, he said, if we can get the deal that we want from Israel. I asked him if he thought that Hamas was winning. He said that their victory is their steadfastness so far, even though he knows they're facing a much greater military opposition. And he said that in his belief that the people of Gaza stand behind Hamas's political leadership and their military fighters on the ground because they want change. What is different compared to 2008, 2009 conflict, 2012 conflict along similar lines? I asked him that question. He told me as well that, that this was different because they're not going to settle. The Palestinian people, he said, are not going to settle for a deal less than this unrestricted, if you will, opening of the borders of Gaza. But I asked him also at the very beginning does he, the political leader of Hamas, all that way distant in Qatar, really have influence over the military men on the battlefield? This is how the interview began.
Hamas is an institutional movement. It has a respected leadership. All the members of Hamas, whether in the political or armed wing, are disciplined. The Israelis, the Egyptians, and the U.S. administration know this. Otherwise, John Kerry would not have intervened.
President Obama said it is irresponsible of Hamas to fire their rockets from civilian neighborhoods. That's what you're doing. Why do you do it when you know civilians are going to die?
Look at the results. How many Israeli civilians did our rockets kill? Israel knows the number. Meanwhile, how many Palestinian civilians has Israel killed? Up until now, it killed 1,700 people, while we killed, by Israel's own admission, 63 soldiers. We kill soldiers, combatants, while they kill civilians.
Because you're firing your rockets from civilian neighborhoods. That's where you're firing your rockets from. Your rockets are fired, Israel says, indiscriminately to civilian areas, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. President Obama says you're firing your rockets from civilian neighborhoods, and you know what that means, that you will have high civilian casualties. Critics are saying that the only reason that you're doing this is so that you get the international outpouring of international sympathy because of the high civilian casualties?
It is unfortunate that the U.S. administration and President Obama have adopted the Israeli narrative, which is a lie. Hamas sacrifices itself for its people and does not use its people as human shields to protect its soldiers. These are lies, and Hamas does not seek international sympathy through its own victims.
But what is very clear here, Wolf, in the discussions that I had before and after the cameras were rolling, is that certainly this high civilian death toll, Hamas believes, is bringing an internationalization to the current situation that they believe should work in their favor, that the international community also wants to get a deal between Hamas and Israel that will last and endure and end the high death toll at the moment. So there certainly is a belief from Hamas that this is, if you will, cynically working in this favor, this high civilian death toll, although quite clearly Khaled Meshaal says we're not doing this to create a high civilian death toll. I also asked him about the issue of weapons being stored in schools, rockets and such like being stored in schools. He said, and this is what Khaled Meshaal said, he said that is absolutely not true. We do not do that. Look, he said 60 mosques and schools have been destroyed across Gaza. He said, do you think Hamas controls all those buildings and has weapons there? He said he invites international monitors to come into Gaza. However unrealistic this may sound, he invites international monitors to come to Gaza to see that they're not doing that, Wolf.
You know, Nick, Khaled Meshaal used to be based in Damascus, Syria, until that civil war really erupted. Now he's in Doha, Qatar. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu constantly ridicules him, saying he's living in five-star hotels in Doha, Qatar, while his people are suffering in Gaza. What does he say about that? Why isn't he in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, his view, and it's been this way for a long time. I mean, we have to remember, of course, Khaled Meshaal, when he was in Jordan, living in Jordan, Israeli Secret Service agents tried to kill him, poison him. It took King Hussein of Jordan at the time to appeal to the Israelis to get the antidote to allow him to live. He doesn't feel safe going back to Gaza again to live. That's why he was in Damascus. When the conflict began there, he decided it wasn't safe. Qatar gave him a home. His logic is that he is safer, and as a political leader is just as connected with his people on the ground as if he were there. He feels safer clearly in Qatar. He feels certainly safer there today than he does when he was living in Damascus as well. I met him and interviewed him a couple of times in Damascus over the recent years as well. But he insists 2008, 2009, 2012, they went through this same scenario, a conflict in Gaza, the accusations that he, Khaled Meshaal, was not really fully politically representative of the feeling on the ground in Gaza. He says, look, the leadership has endured. Strategically, Wolf, whatever gap there is and difficulties in communications, strategically, he, Khaled Meshaal, and the leadership on the ground there in Gaza are headed in the same broad direction. And it certainly appears that they're willing to let one horse lead at one moment, one horse lead at the other, but essentially they're pulling in the same direction. And their strategy very clearly is to show that there isn't any gap between the military, between the political leadership. That's clearly his message. And the reality we've seen over recent years, recent conflicts there, Wolf, is it does seem to endure.